I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Editing Podcast. So we have a guest this week, and it's Sarah Calfee of Three Little Words. Welcome, Sarah. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Sarah. So Sarah's a specialist romance editor who works predominantly with independent authors. And as she asks on her website, are you writing a kissing book? Sarah, I just love that. It's wonderful branding.
It really is. It really just frames exactly what it is that you do. So Sarah, can you start by telling us a little bit about the kinds of editing that you do? Is it developmental? Is it copy editing? What do you focus on?
I do all the editings except proofreading. I do developmental, substantive, line and copy editing, and I'm thinking about how to add book coaching to my services.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what book coaching is and how maybe that differs from developmental editing?
To be honest, I am still trying to figure that out.
Right.
A lot of people in the romance editors are offering that as a service. And I think it's because a lot of romance authors are just trying out and they're trying to figure out how to write their romance books, which is actually a lot harder than people expect it to be. And I think with book coaching, you take it step by step. So instead of coming in with an entire manuscript, you come in with an idea or maybe a partial manuscript, and you sit down with your editor and you do maybe 3 or 4 chapters and discuss and go back and rewrite. So it's
maybe a lot more custom, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like a lot more tailored towards the actual particular author's needs rather than the kind of more structured approach that a full-on developmental edit might take.
I think it also sounds maybe a bit less threatening to a new author as well, that you're framing it as coaching, so they're learning from, and it's like you're working together rather than that sort of I think some people think of editing as being much more sort of transactional. They hand you something, you give them something back. It's like maybe you're working alongside them a little bit more if you frame it as coaching. So the wording, isn't it?
Teacher-student kind of approach. Yeah. That's brilliant. So Sarah, why did you choose to specialise in romance editing? What appealed?
Okay, well, there are 2 reasons. The first is because the thought of generalizing and trying to be good at all kinds of genres sent me into a panic. Back when I was in my MFA program, we did lots of workshopping, and I just remember all the different kind of stories. Sometimes I couldn't give decent feedback if I didn't know the rules of a specific genre. So I decided to pick one genre and really dig into its plot, and all those rules only people in the community know. I chose romance specifically because it's huge with lots of indie authors, and it seemed like a great place to find clients.
So that's a very sort of business strategic approach that you've taken there, Sarah. You've obviously thought very carefully about why romance editing. I want to know, do you read romance as well, or did you before you made this decision?
That was going to be my question.
Was it?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I didn't really read that much romance. I always was like romance adjacent. Like I always loved Pride and Prejudice, and I always enjoyed a romance in a story, but I was kind of put off from like the 90s romances from when I was a teenager and in my early 20s. And then, I came back around to it, and I got totally hooked. Modern romance is amazing. The older stuff is pretty good too, but like, it's just, once you realize how complex and hard it is to write a truly good romance, you can really appreciate the effort that puts into it. And it's just so much of it can be really funny and enjoyable, and it's just that the characters are gonna be happy at the end, and right now with pandemic
we need a little bit of that.
It's just so nice to go into a book and feel like you're gonna be happy, and nobody has to die. There has to be nobody has to be violenced.
It's totally the other end of the spectrum of the stuff that I love to read, which is like horror and post-apocalyptic fiction and that sort of thing. But I do enjoy a good romance and a happy ending every now and again. Sarah, you've already mentioned how potentially what a huge market it is for an editor, and generally as a publishing market it is, I think, if not, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest genres, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the market and the difference perhaps between indie authors and publishers and how they approach it and how you work with them?
Okay, the answer is not really.
Okay.
But I'll explain something different.
I love an honest guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on.
No. I have stuff I can say about the market. I don't know specific things about the market.
That's
I can
fine.
tell you that there are a lot of traditional publishers. I know a few of their names, but I've never really looked at them too closely because honestly, from the editing perspective, they pay very badly, in my opinion, and I'd rather work with an independent author. So that's what I focused on. Another thing I know is that out of the thousands and thousands and thousands of romance readers, I think about half of them also want to write books.
That's interesting, isn't it?
And out of that half, maybe about 25% will actually go off and try it, maybe even hire an editor. So there are so many authors out there, or future authors. So the market is really big in that area. Also, it's a huge community. They call themselves Romancelandia. And it includes everything. It's the books, the readers, the publishers, the authors, the podcasts that talk about the books, the Facebook groups for romance readers and authors. There's even a romance editing Facebook group. There are websites that talk about and review romance books. There's romance Twitter, where you can follow many romance authors, and they talk about current events in Romancelandia. They talk about the books they're working on. There's stuff on Instagram, TikTok, BookTube, that's YouTube, where people talk about romance books. I don't follow those last three. I'm too old, I guess. But the point is, it's huge. And there's a lot of people in that community. It can be a little overwhelming, but I have my favorite places to hang out.
So Sarah, with that in mind, if you were, if someone out there listening to this is a new fiction editor, they're developing their market, and they think they would like to specialize in fiction, romance fiction editing, because there's so much in that community, where would you suggest that they start, just as a kind of an intro to get a sense of that community you're talking about? Is there one group or a couple of groups that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's actually. My very favorite website is called Smart Bitches Trashy Books.
What a great name.
And the woman who runs it is called Sarah Wendell. She also has a podcast called, I think it's Smart Bitches something podcast.
We'll look it up and we'll put it in the show notes.
In the show notes, yeah.
And she's really great. She's been around for like, I don't know, 20 years. She's written a really great book called Beyond Heaving Bosoms, The Smart Bitch's Guide to Romance Novels.
Well, they've got the best names. Are you writing a kissing book? Smart Bitches. I'm loving it. Bosoms. I think I might move from crime to and thrillers to romance.
Yeah, you just write about stabby things, don't you?
But this book gives a general history about romance. It's a little bit dated at this point, but it's still really good. And her website is very on point for everything that's happening now. I have a very favorite podcast called Heaving Bosoms, and there are two best friends who recap a romance novel every week, and they're hilarious. And they just talk about romance novels, and it's really interesting from the perspective of an editor, because you can listen to, what interested them about the book, what they thought was boring, and you learn a lot about like how romance plot works and just from the point of view of the reader, which is really good.
I always think that's a really useful thing to do. I think we've said it in the podcast before, that a great podcast to listen to hear how readers deconstruct a book is My Dad Wrote a Porno, because they talk about it and the character development and the plot and the timelines, and it's very funny as well. But it's not necessarily what you would think about as a go-to to learn about developmental editing a book, but there are certainly lots of things to learn there that you can apply as an editor or a writer, and have a good laugh while you listen to it as well.
Yeah,
well, I've heard of My Dad Wrote a Porno. I haven't listened to it yet, but it's definitely on my
it's good
to
fun.
listen to list.
Yes.
So what about can we talk now about tropes and challenges and styles that stand out with romance editing, and what wannabe romance editors might need to consider in relation to those things?
Okay, I have a few things to say about that. Well, the number one rule to remember about romance is that the book must have an HEA. That means happily ever after. If you're in romance, you know what HEA means. Or HFN, that means happy for now. If a novel doesn't have an HEA, it's not a romance. The romance reader goes to a romance book for the HEA. That's something that Romancelandia gets really, really annoyed about if you argue about it. Would you ever argue whether a cozy murder mystery should avoid the murder?
No. That's really interesting, because I don't think a lot of people who don't work in this field would necessarily think about in those terms, but there are absolutely audience expectations in a crime book or a thriller. There needs to have been crime committed. I mean, that's just standard. And so, in a romance, there needs to be
happy ever after.
Yeah.
So anybody in their ignorance writing something that didn't have a happy ever after ending would presumably get slated in reviews and things like that because it didn't fulfill the reader expectations.
Yes, they would get murdered.
Right. And then it would be a crime.
And then they'd be up to me.
Yes. They would be very upset. And they might not sell more books. It's very...
Sarah, that's such a useful thing. That's a really excellent nugget. Thank you for passing that on, because people thinking about going into this field, that's something obviously an editor needs to know, so they can guide authors in that way. And not understanding that is that would be a flaw in their knowledge. So thanks for that. That's a brilliant takeaway.
Another thing I think is that want-to-be romance editors need to take into consideration is that Romancelandia is very, very serious about romance. They're very aware that the world looks down on them. And if you come into the community with the attitude that romance is trash or unintelligent, you'll get eviscerated. Because the women who write the romance are often lawyers or, high-end professional people. They love their romance, but they're really, really clever. So you just don't want to mess with them.
Good point. Because I think there is this, you're dead right about the sort of snooty view of romance that's sort of pervasive in, a lot of sort of reading communities or publishing communities that sort of look down on it if they don't work in it and they don't want to understand it. So
which is outrageous, isn't it? Given that so many people want to read it. That's like disrespecting people's right to choose what they enjoy reading, and the market has spoken.
Exactly. And I don't want to say that Romancelandia doesn't have a sense of humor, because they do laugh at more of the ridiculous aspects of romance, like the clinch covers, those old covers with the wind and the hair and the boobs and the legs, but they do it with love and affection, and they actually like the covers, but they'll talk about it and they make fun of it, but it's not done in a disrespectful manner. So that's really important. You have to come in with respect.
That's a really good point. Have you any other little nuggets for us, Sarah? Because I'm soaking these up here.
Well, people have a misconception that writing romance is easy. Wannabe editors might come in and think the same thing. It does look easy. A good romance book feels light and fluffy. But I think a good reference point is ballet. The dancers look like they're floating above the stage, but beneath it is bleeding toes and hours of practice.
That's a good analogy, actually. That really is. Do you think that's maybe why so many romance readers want to become authors, because they maybe initially think that it looks easy?
Yeah, possibly. Possibly. Yeah, definitely.
I wonder also if it's to do with the fact that most of us, not all of us, but most of us have experienced romance.
Yeah.
And so it's something that we think, you know, there's that old trope, write what you know. And so people have an idea of what might be involved, whereas not everybody's committed a crime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's definitely one of the reasons why.
It's relatable. Yeah.
The reason why it's so hard to write a romance is because the story, the action of the story, happens inside the hearts and the minds of the two protagonists. It's an emotional journey, and that means there has to be a lot of character development behind the scenes. And you have to write strategically to ensure you hit all the romance beats and create specific conflict that triggers the emotions of the protagonists. It's easy to get wrong, but when it's right, it's magic.
Oh, you know what's really great coming across here as well, that is that not only did you make quite a strategic decision to go down this route, but also you have it's clearly obvious to me that you have a very, very clear understanding of what's required, but your passion's coming across as well. And there's no, Denise and I have said it before, when you enjoy your work, when you're passionate about your work, then I think it makes us better editors, and that's really, really coming across here. It's brilliant.
Thank you. And I do love it. I love romance, and I'm passionate for my authors, and I'm always excited to work with them.
So Sarah, a little bird tells us that you are in the process of writing a book. Is that right? Yes.
Yes, I have a book that is almost completed.
So why don't you tell us about it, and tell us how it's going to help budding romance editors and authors to understand these complexities that you've been talking about with romance editing and writing. And you're doing this through the lens of an existing text, aren't you?
What actually inspired me to write How to Pride and Prejudice is to explain some pretty tricky concepts to authors, how to write romance in an understandable way. The hardest thing about writing a romance is creating the conflict between two main characters. Two people meet, they fall in love, and they HEA. But where's the story? How do you make the conflict? You can't pit two romance leads against one another, and you can't have them getting along the whole time. The readers are there to see the emotional struggle each character has to overcome to get to their HEA, and they want to be swept away by the romance. So explaining how to create this conflict is tricky. I have to say words like core conflict and character arcs and emotional journey. And I wanted an excellent way to show people what I'm talking about. I thought Pride and Prejudice would be the perfect example of an emotional journey because there's literally no external action except for people drinking tea in drawing rooms or dancing at balls.
That's so true.
Any exciting physical action occurs off page. And yet, this romance story is an emotional roller coaster. So how do you create conflict for romance characters? Let me just give you one little example. There's Darcy, and he's the hero of Pride and Prejudice, and he's a wealthy and proud man. He'd never consider marrying a woman below his status. So Jane Austen created a heroine who intrigues him with a lively personality and her constant teasing. The problem is she's not of equal rank, she has no inheritance, and worst of all, she has a wildly embarrassing family. So you can already see where Jane Austen was going and where the conflict might come. So the book covers romance plot, the emotional journey from beginning to end. Using Pride and Prejudice, I go into detail about how to create romance protagonists as a pair for maximum emotional conflict. I discuss strategies for how to create more conflict through the middle of the story, and I break down how to create an emotionally satisfying, happy ending.
You know what? I think the fact that you've One thing I keep hearing is when sometimes when people have listened to our podcasts or Denise's blogs that Denise and I have written, what we often hear time and time again is thank you for the examples. And what you've done is built a teaching tool out, but using one giant example, which means the readers have always got a frame of reference, and that's so useful.
When you, I think it's brilliant. You're talking about
idea.
abstract concepts. It's very difficult for people to hang them on something without you giving them guidance. So, like you say, using Pride and Prejudice as a framework for your teaching is, I think, inspired.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Who hasn't heard of it? Who's interested in romance?
Exactly. And it's an awesome book.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. As yours will be as well, I'm sure. Yeah.
So Sarah, who will most benefit from your book? Editors, writers, and when will it be available?
Well, I think anyone who's interested in learning about structure, plot, and emotional journey of the romance can benefit from this book. And I don't have it available yet, but you can pre-order it, and there are links on my website and on Amazon. I'm hoping to have the book available by May 2022. And in the meantime, I have a breakdown of how Jane Austen plotted out Pride and Prejudice, which is available for free as a download on my website.
Brilliant. We'll put the links to all those links in the show notes for this episode, Sarah, so people can find your free download and sign up for pre-order, and presumably keep updated about the progress of your book's publication via your website too.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
So that's it for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can rate, review, and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you prefer.
Yes, thank you so much for listening to the Editing Podcast. Thanks again to Sarah for being such a fantastic guest. She's been Louise.
And she's been Denise. And the other one's been Sarah. Join us again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.